Chapter 25, Cold War America, 1945 to 1963. In the autumn of 1950, a little-known California congressman running for the Senate named Richard M. Nixon stood before reporters in Los Angeles. His opponent, Helen Gahagan Douglas, was a Hollywood actress and a New Deal Democrat. Nixon told the gathered supporters that Douglas had cast communist-leaning votes, and that she was pink right down to her underwear. Gahagan's voting record was not much different from Nixon's. But tarring her with communism made her seem un-American, and Nixon defeated the Pink Lady with nearly 60% of the vote. A few months earlier, U.S. tanks, planes, and artillery supplies had arrived in French Indochina. A French colony since the 19th century, Indochina, present-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, was home to an independence movement led by Ho Chi Minh and supported by the Soviet Union and China. In the summer of 1950, President Harry S. Truman authorized $15 million worth of military supplies to aid France, which was fighting Ho's army to keep possession of its Indo-Chinese Empire. Neither national independence nor democratic evolution exists in any area dominated by Soviet imperialism, Secretary of State Dean Acheson warned ominously as he announced U.S. support for French imperialism. Connecting these coincidental historical moments, one domestic and the other international, was a decades-old force in American life that gained renewed strength after World War II: anti-communism. Connecting these coincidental historical moments, one domestic, the other international, was a decades-old force in American life that gained renewed strength after World War II: anti-communism. The events in Los Angeles and Vietnam, however different on the surface, were part of a global geopolitical struggle between the democratic United States and communist authoritarian Soviet Union, known as the Cold War. Beginning in Europe as World War II ended and extending to Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East and Africa by the mid-1950s, the Cold War reshaped international relations and dominated global politics for more than 40 years. In the United States, the Cold War fostered suspicion of subversives in government, education, and the media. The arms race that developed between the two superpowers prompted Congress to boost military expenditures. The resulting military-industrial complex enhanced the power of the corporations that built planes, munitions, and electronic devices. In politics, the Cold War stifled liberal initiatives as the New Deal coalition tried to advance its domestic agenda in the shadow of anti-communism. In these ways, the line between the international and the domestic blurred, and that blurred line was another enduring legacy of the Cold War. Identify the big idea. In the first 2 decades of the Cold War, how did competition on the international stage and a climate of fear at home affect politics, society, and culture in the United States? Containment and a divided global order. Containment and a divided global order. The Cold War began on the heels of World War II and ended in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. While it lasted, this conflict raised 2 critical questions at the center of global history. What conditions and whose interests would determine the balance of power in Europe and Asia? And how would the developing nations, the European colonies in Asia and the Middle East and Africa, gain their independence and take their place on the world stage? Cold War rivalry framed the possible answers to both questions as it drew the United States into a prolonged engagement with world affairs, unprecedented in the nation's history, that continues to the present day. Origins of the Cold War. World War II set the basic conditions for the Cold War, with Germany and Japan defeated and Britain and France weakened by years of war. Only 2 geopolitical powers remained standing in 1945. Even had nothing divided them, the United States and the Soviet Union would have jostled each other as they moved to fill the post-war vacuum. But of course, the two countries were divided by geography, history, ideology, and strategic interest. Little united them other than their commitment to defeating the Axis powers. President Franklin Roosevelt understood that maintaining the U.S.-Soviet alliance was essential for post-war global stability. But he also believed that permanent peace and long-term U.S. interests depended on the Wilsonian principles of collective security, self-determination, and free trade. Yalta. At the Yalta Conference of February 1945, Wilsonian principles yielded to U.S.-Soviet power realities. As Allied forces neared victory in Europe and advanced toward Japan in the Pacific, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met in Yalta, a resort in southern Ukraine on the Black Sea. Yalta, the Black Sea. Roosevelt focused on maintaining Allied unity and securing Stalin's commitment to enter the war against Japan, but the fates of the nations of Eastern Europe divided the Big Three. Stalin insisted that Russian national security required pro-Soviet governments in Eastern Europe. Roosevelt pressed for an agreement, the Declaration on Liberated Europe, that guaranteed self-determination and democratic elections in Poland and neighboring countries such as Romania and Hungary. However, given the presence of Soviet troops in those nations, FDR had to accept a pledge from Stalin to hold free and unfettered elections at a future time. The three leaders also formalized their commitment to divide Germany into 4 administrative zones, each controlled by one of the 4 Allied powers, and to similarly partition the capital city, Berlin, which was located in the middle of the Soviet zone. At Yalta, the Big Three also agreed to establish an international body to replace the discredited League of Nations, based on plans drawn up at the 1944 Dumbarton Oaks Conference in Washington, D.C. The new organization, to be known as the United Nations, would have both a General Assembly, in which all nations would be represented, and a Security Council composed of 5 major Allied powers: the United States, Britain, France, China, and the Soviet Union, and 7 other nations elected on a rotating basis. The Big Three determined that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council should have veto power over the decisions of the General Assembly. They announced that the United Nations would convene for the first time in San Francisco, April 25, 1945. Potsdam. Following the Yalta Conference, developments over the ensuing years further hardened relations between the Soviets on one side and the Americans and British on the other. At the Potsdam Conference outside Berlin in July of 1945, Harry Truman replaced the deceased Roosevelt. Inexperienced in world affairs and thrown into an enormously complicated negotiations, Truman's instinct was to stand up to Stalin. Unless Russia is faced with an iron fist and strong language, he said, another war is in the making. But Truman was in no position to realign events in Eastern Europe, where Soviet-imposed governments in Poland, Hungary, and Romania were backed by the Red Army and could not be eliminated by Truman's bluster. In Poland and Romania in particular, Stalin was determined to establish communist governments, punish wartime Nazi collaborators, and win boundary concessions that augmented Soviet territory. The Soviet leader sought eastern Polish lands for the Soviet Union and sought to make far northeastern Germany part of Poland. Yalta and Potsdam thus set the stage for communist rule to descend over Eastern Europe. The elections called for at Yalta eventually took place in Finland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia with varying degrees of democratic openness. Nevertheless, Stalin got the client regimes he desired in those countries, and would soon exert near-complete control over their governments. Stalin's unwillingness to honor self-determination for nations in Eastern Europe was, from the American point of view, the precipitating event of the Cold War. Germany represented the biggest challenge of all. American officials at Potsdam believed that a revived German economy was essential. Germany represented the biggest challenge of all. American officials at Potsdam believed that a revived German economy was essential to ensuring the prosperity of democratic regimes throughout the Western Europe, and to keeping ordinary Germans from turning again to Nazism. In contrast, Stalin hoped merely to extract reparations from Germany in the form of industrial machines and goods. In exchange for recognizing the new German-Polish border, Truman and Secretary of State James Byrnes convinced the Soviet leader to accept German reparations only from the Soviet zone, which lay in the far eastern and largely rural portion of Germany and promised little wealth or German industry to plunder. As they had done for Europe as a whole, the Yalta and Potsdam agreements paved the way for the division of Germany into East and West. Yalta and Potsdam had demonstrated that in private negotiations, the United States and the Soviet Union had starkly different objectives. Subsequent public utterances only intensified those differences. In February of 1946, Stalin delivered a speech in which he insisted that according to Marxist-Leninist principles, the unevenness of development of the capitalist countries was likely to produce violent disturbance and even another war. He seemed to blame any future war on the capitalist West. Churchill responded in kind a month later. While visiting Truman in Missouri to be honored for his wartime leadership, Churchill accused Stalin of raising an iron curtain around Eastern Europe and allowing police government to rule its people. He went further, claiming that a fraternal association of English-speaking peoples and not Russians ought to set the terms for the post-war world. The cities and fields of Europe had barely ceased to run with the blood of World War II before they were menaced again by the tense standoff between the Soviet Union and the United States, with Stalin intent on establishing client states in Eastern Europe, and the United States equally intent on reviving Germany and ensuring collective security throughout Europe. The points of agreement were few and far between. Among the Allies, anxiety about Nazi victory in World War II had been quickly replaced by fear of a potentially more cataclysmic war with the Soviet Union. The containment strategy. Hold on. Before I do the containment strategy, a couple teaching tips here. As an accompaniment to this chapter, you may wish to use clips from the 15-part documentary series from ABC and the History Channel, The Century, America's Time. Teaching tip, the AP U.S. History Curriculum Framework requires students to know how the United States developed a foreign policy based on containment. In the late 1940s, American officials developed a clear strategy towards the Soviet Union that would become known as containment. Convinced that the USSR was methodically expanding its reach, the United States would counter by limiting Stalin's influence to Eastern Europe while reconstituting democratic governments in Western Europe. In 1946-47, three specific issues worried Truman and his advisors. First, the Soviet Union was pressing Iran for access to oil and Turkey for access to the Mediterranean Sea. Second, a civil war broke out. A civil war was roiling in Greece between monarchists backed by England and insurgents supported by the Greek and Yugoslavian communist parties. Third, as European nations suffered through terrible privation in 1946 and 47, communist parties gained strength, particularly in France and Italy. All three developments, as seen from the United States, threatened to expand the influence of the Soviet Union outside of Eastern Europe, toward an uneasy peace. In this anxious context, the strategy of containment emerged in a series of incremental steps between 1946 and 1949. In February of 1946, American diplomat George F. Kennan first proposed the idea in an 8,000-word cable, a confidential message to the U.S. State Department from his post at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. Kennan argued that the Soviet Union was an Oriental despotism, and that communism was merely the fig leaf, justifying Soviet aggression. A year after writing this cable, dubbed the Long Telegram, he published an influential foreign affairs article arguing that the West's only recourse was to meet the Soviets with unalterable counterforce at every point where they show signs of encroaching upon the interests of a peaceful and stable world. Kennan called for long-term, patient but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. Containment, the key word, came to define America's evolving strategic stance towards the Soviet Union. Kennan believed that the Soviet system was inherently unstable and would eventually collapse. Containment would work, he reasoned, as long as the United States and its allies opposed Soviet expansion in all parts of the world. Kennan's attentive readers included Stalin himself, who quickly obtained a copy of the classified long telegram. The Soviet leader saw the United States as an imperialist aggressor determined to replace Great Britain as the world's dominant capitalist power. Just as Kennan thought that the Soviet system was despotic and unstable and unsustainable, Stalin believed that the West suffered from its own fatal weaknesses. Neither side completely understood or trusted the other, and each projected its worst fears onto the other. In fact, Britain's influence in the world was declining. Exhausted by war, facing enormous budget deficits and a collapsing economy at home, and confronted with a determined independence movement in India led by Mohandas Gandhi and growing nationalist movements throughout its empire, Britain was waning as a global power. The reins of world leadership are fast slipping from Britain's competent but now very weak hands, read a U.S. State Department report. These reins will be picked up either by the United States or by Russia. The United States was wedded to the notion dating to the Wilson administration that communism and capitalism were incompatible on the world stage. With Britain faltering, American officials saw little choice but to fill its shoes. It did not take long for the reality of Britain's decline to resonate across the Atlantic. In February of 1947, London informed Truman that it could no longer afford to support the anti-communists in the Greek Civil War. Truman worried that a communist victory in Greece would lead to Soviet domination of the Eastern Mediterranean and embolden communist parties in France and Italy. In response, the president announced what became known as the Truman Doctrine. In a speech on March 12th, he asserted an American responsibility to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. To that end, Truman proposed large-scale assistance for Greece and Turkey, then involved in a dispute with the Soviet Union over the Dardanelles, a strait connecting the Aegean Sea and the Sea of Marmara. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, Truman declared, thinking like a historian, page 810. Despite the open-endedness of this military commitment, Congress quickly approved Truman's request for $300 million in aid to Greece and $100 million for Turkey. Soviet expansionism was part of a larger story. Europe was sliding into economic chaos. Already devastated by the war in 1947, the continent suffered the worst winter in memory. People were starving, credit was non-existent, wages were stagnant, and the consumer market had collapsed. For both humanitarian and practical reasons, Truman's advisors believed something had to be done. A global depression might ensue if the European economy, the largest foreign market for American goods, did not recover. Worse, unemployment and dispirited Western Europeans might fill the ranks of the communist parties, threatening political stability and the legitimacy of the United States. Secretary of State George C. Marshall came up with a remarkable proposal: a massive infusion of American capital to rebuild the European economy. Speaking at Harvard University commencement in June of 1947, Marshall urged the nations of Europe to work out a comprehensive recovery program based on U.S. aid. This pledge of financial assistance required congressional approval, but the plan ran into opposition in Washington. Republicans castigated the Marshall Plan as a huge international WPA. But in the midst of the congressional stalemate, on February 25, 1948, Stalin supported a communist-led coup in Czechoslovakia. Congress rallied and voted overwhelmingly in 1948 to approve the Marshall Plan. Over the next 4 years, the United States contributed nearly $13 billion to a highly successful recovery effort that benefited both Western Europe and the United States. European industrial production increased by 64%, and the appeal of communist parties waned in the West. Markets for American goods grew stronger and fostered economic interdependence between Europe and the United States. Notably, however, the Marshall Plan intensified Cold War tensions. U.S. officials invited the Soviets to participate, but insisted on certain restrictions that would virtually guarantee Stalin's refusal. When Stalin refused, ordering Soviet client states to do so as well, the onus of dividing Europe appeared to fall on the Soviet leader and deprived his threadbare partners of assistance they sorely needed. East and West in the new Europe. The flashpoint for a hot war remained Germany, the most important industrial economy and the key strategic landmass in Europe. When no agreement could be reached to unify the four zones of occupation into a single state, the Western Allies consolidated their three zones in 1947. They then prepared to establish an independent federal German republic. Marshall Plan funds would jumpstart economic recovery. Some of those funds were slated for West Berlin in hopes of making the city a capitalist showplace 100 miles deep inside the Soviet zone. Stung by the West's intention to create a German republic, in June of 1948, Stalin blockaded all traffic into West Berlin. Instead of yielding, as Stalin had expected, Truman and the British were resolute. "We're going to stay, period," Truman said plainly. Over the next year, American and British pilots, who had been dropping bombs on Berlin only 4 years earlier, improvised the Berlin Airlift, which flew 2.5 million tons of food and fuel into the western zones of the city, nearly a ton for each resident. Military officials reported to Truman that General Lucius D. Clay, the American commander in Berlin, was nervous and on edge, drawn as tight as a steel spring. But after a prolonged stalemate, Stalin backed down. On May 12, 1949, he lifted the blockade until the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The Berlin crisis was the closest the two sides came to actual war, and West Berlin became a symbol of resistance to communism. The crisis in Berlin persuaded Western European nations to forge a collective security pact with the United States. In April of 1949, for the first time since the end of the American Revolution, the United States entered into a peacetime military alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Under the NATO pact, 12 nations, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, and Great Britain, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, and the United States, agreed that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. In May of 1949, those nations also agreed to the creation of the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, which eventually joined NATO in 1955. In response, the Soviet Union established the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon, and in 1955 the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance for Eastern Europe that included Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and the Soviet Union. In these parallel steps, the two superpowers had institutionalized the Cold War through a massive division of the continent. By the early 1950s, West and East were the stark markers of the new Europe. As Churchill had observed in 1946, the line dividing the two stretched from Stettin in the Baltic to the Trieste in the Adriatic, cutting off tens of millions of Eastern Europeans from the rest of the continent. Stalin's tactics had often been ruthless, but they were not without reason. The Soviet Union acted out of the sort of self-interest that had long defined powerful nations, ensuring defensive perimeter of allies seeking access to raw materials and possessing the advantage that victory in war allowed. NSC 68. Atomic developments, too, played a critical role in the emergence of the Cold War. As the sole nuclear power at the end of World War II, the United States entertained the possibility of international control of nuclear technology, but did not wish to lose its advantage over the Soviet Union. When the American Bernard Baruch proposed United Nations oversight of atomic energy in 1946, for instance, the plan assured the United States of near total control of the technology, which further increased Cold War tensions. America's brief tenure as the sole nuclear power ended in September of 1949, however, when the Soviet Union detonated an atomic bomb. Truman then turned to the U.S. National Security Council, NSC, established by the National Security Act of 1947 for a strategic reassessment. In April of 1950, the NSC delivered a report known as NSC 68. The British, bristling with alarmist rhetoric, the U.S. approach to the Cold War. The report's authors described the Soviet Union not as a typical great power, but as one with a fanatic faith that seeks to impose its absolute authority. Going beyond even the stern language used by George Kennan, NSC 68 casts Soviet ambitions as nothing short of the domination of the Eurasian landmass. To prevent that outcome, the report proposed a bold and massive program of rebuilding the West's defensive potential to surpass that of the Soviet world. America Compared, page 814. This included the development of a hydrogen bomb, a thermonuclear device that would be 1,000 times more destructive than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan, as well as dramatic increases in conventional military forces. Critically, NSC 68 called for Americans to pay higher taxes to support the new military program and to accept whatever sacrifices were necessary to achieve national unity of purpose against the Soviet enemy. Many historians see the report as having militarized the American approach to the Cold War, which had to that point relied largely on economic measures such as aid to Greece and the Marshall Plan. Truman was reluctant to commit a major defense buildup, fearing that it would overburden the national budget. But shortly after NSC 68 was completed, events in Asia led him to reverse course. Containment in Asia. As with Germany, American officials believed that restoring Japan's economy while limiting its military influence would ensure prosperity and contain communism in East Asia. After dismantling Japan's military, American occupation forces under General Douglas MacArthur drafted a democratic constitution and paved the way for the restoration of Japanese sovereignty in 1951. Considering the scorched earth war that had just ended, this was a remarkable achievement, thanks partly to the imperious MacArthur, but mainly to the Japanese, who embraced peace and accepted U.S. military protection. However, events on the mainland of Asia proved much more difficult for the United States to shape to its advantage. Civil War in China. A civil war had been raging in China since the 1930s, as communist forces led by Mao Zedong, fought nationalist forces under Jiang Kai-shek. Fearing a communist victory between 1945 and 1949, the United States provided $2 billion to Jiang's army. Pressing Truman to save China, conservative Republican Ohio Senator Robert A. Taft predicted that the Far East is ultimately even more important to our future peace than is Europe. By 1949, Mao's forces held the advantage. Truman reasoned that to save Jiang, the United States would have to intervene militarily. Unwilling to do so, he cut off aid and left the nationalists to their fate. People's Republic of China was formally established under Mao on October 1, 1949, and the remnants of Jiang's forces fled to Taiwan. Both Stalin and Truman expected Mao to take an independent line, as the communist leader Tito had just done in Yugoslavia. Mao, however, aligned himself with the Soviet Union, partly out of fear that the United States would rearm the nationalists and invade the mainland. As attitudes hardened, many Americans viewed Mao's success as a defeat for the United States. The pro-nationalist China lobby accused Truman's State Department of being responsible for the loss of China. Sensitive to these charges, the Truman administration refused to recognize Red China and blocked China's admission to the United Nations. But the United States pointedly declined to guarantee Taiwan's independence and in fact accepted the outcome on the mainland. Since 1982, however, the United States has recognized Taiwanese sovereignty. The Korean War. The United States took a stronger stance in Korea. The United States and the Soviet Union had agreed at the close of World War II to occupy the Korean Peninsula, jointly jointly, temporarily dividing the former Japanese colony at the 38th parallel. As tensions rose in Europe, the 38th parallel hardened into a permanent demarcation line. The Soviets supported a communist government led by Kim Il-sung in North Korea. The United States backed a right-wing nationalist Syngman Rhee in South Korea. The two sides had waged a low-level war since 1945, and both leaders were spoiling for a more definitive fight. Teaching tip: AP U.S. History Curriculum Framework requires students to know that the U.S. effort to contain communism encountered strong nationalist movements in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Strong nationalist movements in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East clashed with the U.S. efforts to contain communism. Teaching tip: the Korean War was the first confrontation between the two nuclear powers. Explore the ramifications of this conflict by screening all or part of the PBS American Experience episode Race for the Superbomb. PBS URL. Race for the Superbomb. Okay. Anyways, back to that Korean War, more definitive fight. However, neither Kim nor Rhee could launch an all-out offensive without the backing of his sponsor. Washington repeatedly said no, and so did Moscow. But Kim continued to press Stalin to permit him to reunify the nation. Convinced by the North Koreans that victory would be swift, the Soviet leader finally relented in the spring of 1950. On June 25, 1950, the North Koreans launched a surprise attack across the 38th parallel. Truman immediately asked the UN Security Council to authorize a police action against the invaders. The Soviet Union was boycotting the Security Council to protest China's exclusion from the United Nations and could not veto Truman's request. With the Security Council's approval of a peacekeeping force, Truman ordered U.S. troops to Korea. The rapidly assembled UN army in Korea was overwhelmingly American, with General Douglas MacArthur in command. At first, the North Koreans held a distinct advantage, but MacArthur's surprise amphibious attack at Incheon gave the UN forces control of Seoul, the South Korean capital, and almost all the territory up to the 38th parallel. The impetus MacArthur then ordered his troops across the 38th parallel and led them all the way to the Chinese border at the Yalu River. It was a major blunder, certain to draw China into the war. Sure enough, a massive Chinese counterattack forced MacArthur's forces into a headlong retreat back down the Korean peninsula. Then stalemate set in. With weak public support for the war in the United States, Truman and his advisors decided to work for a negotiated peace. MacArthur disagreed and denounced the Korean stalemate, declaring there is no substitute for victory. On April 11, 1951, Truman relieved MacArthur of his command. Truman's decision was highly unpopular, especially among conservative Republicans, but he had likely saved the nation from years of costly warfare with China. Notwithstanding MacArthur's dismissal, the war dragged on for more than 2 years. An armistice in July of 1953, pushed by the newly elected president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, left Korea divided at the original demarcation line. North Korea remained firmly allied with the Soviet Union. South Korea signed a mutual defense treaty with the United States. It had been the first major proxy battle of the Cold War in which the Soviet Union and the United States took sides in a civil conflict. It would not be the last. The Korean War had far-reaching consequences. Truman's decision to commit troops without congressional approval set a precedent for future undeclared wars. His refusal to unleash atomic bombs, even when American forces were reeling under a massive Chinese attack, set ground rules for Cold War conflict. The war also expanded American involvement in Asia, transforming containment into a truly global policy and significantly boosting Japan's struggling post-war economy. Finally, the Korean War ended Truman's resistance to a major military buildup. Defense expenditures grew from $13 billion in 1950, roughly one-third of the federal budget, to $50 billion in 1953, nearly two-thirds of the budget. From $13 billion in 1950, roughly one-third of the federal budget, to $50 billion in 1953. Nearly two-thirds of the budget. American foreign policy had become more global, more militarized, and more expensive. Even in times of peace, the United States now functioned in a state of permanent military mobilization. The Munich Analogy. Behind much of the foreign policy of the first 2 decades of the Cold War lay the memory of appeasement, Chapter 24. The generation of politicians and officials who designed the containment strategy had come of age in the shadow of the Munich Conference. The conference in 1938 at which the Western democracies had appeased Hitler by offering him part of Czechoslovakia, paving the road to World War II. Applying the lessons from Munich, American presidents believed that appeasing Stalin and subsequent Soviet rulers, Nikita Khrushchev and Leonid Brezhnev, would have the same result, wider war. Thus, in Germany, Greece, and Korea, later in Iran, Guatemala, and Vietnam, the United States staunchly resisted the Soviets, or what it perceived as Soviet influence. The Munich analogy strengthened the U.S. position in a number of strategic conflicts, particularly over the fate of Germany, but it also drew Americans into armed conflicts and convinced them to support repressive right-wing regimes that compromised as much as supported stated American principles. Cold War liberalism. Harry Truman cast himself in the mold of his predecessor Franklin Roosevelt and hoped to seize the possibilities afforded by victory in World War II to expand the New Deal at home. But the crisis in post-war Europe and Asia, combined with the spectacular rise of anti-communism in the United States, forced him to take a different path. In the end, Truman went down in history not as a New Dealer, but as a Cold Warrior. The Cold War consensus that he ultimately embraced the notion that resisting communism at home and abroad represented America's most important post-war objective shaped the nation's life and politics for decades to come. Truman and the end of reform. Truman and the Democratic Party of the late 1940s and early 1950s forged what historians call Cold War liberalism. They preserved the core programs of the New Deal welfare state, developed the containment policy to oppose Soviet influence throughout the world, and fought so-called subversives at home. But there would be no second act for the New Deal. The Democrats adopted this contribution of moderate liberal policies and anti-communism, Cold War liberalism, partly by choice and partly out of necessity. A few high-level espionage scandals and the communist victories in Eastern Europe and China re-energized the Republican Party, which forced Truman and the Democrats to retreat to what historian Arthur Schlesinger called the vital center of American politics. However, Americans on both the progressive left and the conservative right remained dissatisfied with this development. Cold War liberalism was a practical, centrist policy for a turbulent era, but it would not last. Organized labor remained a key force in the Democratic Party and played a central role in championing Cold War liberalism. Stronger than ever, union membership swelled to more than 14 million by 1945. Determined to make up for their wartime sacrifices, unionized workers made aggressive demands and mounted major strikes in the automobile, steel, and coal industries after the war. Republicans responded. They gained control of the House in a sweeping repudiation of Democrats in 1946 and promptly passed over Truman's veto, the Taft-Hartley Act, 1947, an overhaul of the 1935 National Labor Relations Act. The Taft-Hartley crafted changes in procedures and language that over time weakened the right of workers to organize and engage in collective bargaining. Unions especially disliked Section 14B, which allowed states to pass right-to-work laws prohibiting the union shop. Additionally, the law forced unions to purge communists who had been among the most successful labor organizers in the 1930s. From their ranks, Taft-Hartley effectively contained the labor movement. Trade unions would continue to support the Democratic Party, but the labor movement would not move into the largely non-union South and would not extend into the many American industries that remained unorganized. The 1948 election. Democrats would have dumped Truman in 1948 had they found a better candidate, but the party fell into disarray. The left wing split off and formed the Progressive Party, nominating Henry A. Wallace, an avid New Dealer whom Truman had fired as Secretary of Commerce in 1946 because Wallace opposed America's actions in the Cold War. A right-wing challenge came from the South when Northern liberals such as Mayor Hubert H. Humphrey of Minneapolis pushed through a strong civil rights platform at the Democratic Convention. The Southern delegations bolted and called themselves Dixiecrats, nominated for President South Carolina Governor Strom Thurmond, an ardent supporter of racial segregation. The Republicans, meanwhile, renominated Thomas E. Dewey, the politically moderate governor of New York, who had run a strong campaign against FDR in 1944. Truman surprised everyone. He launched a strenuous cross-country speaking tour and hammered away at Republicans for opposing progressive legislation and in general for running a do-nothing Congress. By combining these issues with attacks on the Soviet menace abroad, Truman began to salvage his troubled campaign. At his rallies, enthusiastic listeners shouted, "Give him hell, Harry." Truman won, receiving 49.6% of the vote to Dewey's 45.1%, map 25.4. This remarkable election foreshadowed coming political turmoil. Truman occupied the center of FDR's sprawling New Deal coalition. On his left were progressives, civil rights activists, and anti-Cold War peace activists. On his right were segregationist Southerners who opposed civil rights and were allied with Republicans on many economic and foreign policy issues. In 1948, Truman performed a delicate balancing act, largely retaining the support of Jewish and Catholic voters in big cities and black voters in the North, and organized labor voters across the country. But Thurman's strong showing he carried 4 states in the Deep South, demonstrated the fragile nature of the Democratic coalition, and prefigured the revolt of the party's southern wing in the 1960s. As he tried to manage contending forces in his own party, Truman faced mounting pressure from Republicans to denounce radicals at home and to take a tough stand against the Soviet Union. The Fair Deal. Despite having to perform a balancing act, Truman and progressive Democrats forged ahead. In 1949, reaching ambitiously to extend the New Deal, Truman proposed the Fair Deal: national health insurance, aid to education, a housing program, expansion of Social Security, a higher minimum wage, and a new agricultural program. In his attention to civil rights, the Fair Deal also reflected the growing role of African Americans in the Democratic Party. Congress, however, remained a huge stumbling block, and the Fair Deal fared poorly. The same conservative coalition that had blocked Roosevelt's initiatives in his second term continued the fight against Truman's Cold War pressure, shaped political arguments about domestic social The same conservative coalition that had blocked Roosevelt's initiatives in his second term continued the fight against Truman's Cold War pressure shaped political arguments about domestic social programs, while the nation's growing paranoia over internal subversion weakened support for bold extensions of the welfare state. Truman's proposal for national health insurance, for instance. Coming. I'm coming. I said I was coming.
Just calling your name. I didn't know who you were.
Okay. Yeah. You're good to go.
Took me forever, but I did it.
Cold War liberalism. Harry Truman cast himself as the mold of his predecessor, Franklin Roosevelt, and hoped to seize the possibilities afforded by victory in World War II to expand the New Deal at home. But the crisis in post-war Europe and Asia, combined with the spectacular rise of anti-communism in the United States, forced him to take a different path. In the end, Truman went down in history as a New Dealer, but as a Cold Warrior. The Cold War consensus that he ultimately embraced, the notion that resisting communism at home and abroad represented America's most important post-war objective, shaped the nation's life and politics for decades to come. Truman and the end of reform. Truman and the Democratic Party of the late 1940s and early 1950s forged what historians call Cold War liberalism. They preserved the core programs of the New Deal welfare state, developed the containment policy to oppose Soviet influence throughout the world, and fought so-called subversives at home. But there would be no second act for the New Deal. The Democrats adopted this combination of moderate liberal policies and anti-communism Cold War liberalism, partly by choice and partly out of necessity. A few high-level espionage scandals and the communist victories in Eastern Europe and China re-energized the Republican Party, which forced Truman and the Democrats to retreat to what historian Arthur Schlesinger called the vital center of American politics. However, Americans both on the progressive left and the conservative right remained dissatisfied with the development of Cold War liberalism. Was a practical centrist policy for a turbulent era, but it would not last. Organized labor remained a key force in the Democratic Party and played a central role in championing Cold War liberalism. Stronger than ever, Union membership swelled to more than 14 million by 1945. Determined to make up for their wartime sacrifices, unionized workers made aggressive demands and mounted major strikes in the automobile, steel, and coal industries after the war. Republicans responded. They gained control of the House in a sweeping repudiation of Democrats in 1946 and promptly passed over Truman's veto. The Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, an overhaul of the 1935 National Labor Relations Act. Taft-Hartley crafted changes in procedures and language that over time weakened the rights of workers to organize and engage in collective bargaining. Unions especially disliked Section 14B, which allowed states to pass right-to-work laws prohibiting the union shop. Additionally, the law forced unions to purge communists who had been among the most successful labor organizers in the 1930s from their ranks. Taft-Hartley effectively contained the labor movement. Trade unions would continue to support the Democratic Party, but the labor movement would not move into the largely non-union South and would not extend into the many American industries that remained unorganized. The 1948 election. Democrats would have dumped Truman in 1948 had they found a better candidate, but the party fell into disarray. The left wing split off and formed the Progressive Party, nominating Henry A. Wallace, an avid New Dealer, whom Truman had fired as Secretary of Commerce in 1946 because Wallace opposed America's action in the Cold War. A right-wing challenge came from the South, when Northern liberals such as Mayor Hubert Humphrey of Minneapolis pushed through a strong civil rights platform at the Democratic Convention. The Southern delegations bolted and, calling themselves Dixiecrats, nominated for president South Carolina Governor Strom Thurmond, an ardent supporter of racial segregation. The Republicans, meanwhile, renominated Thomas E. Dewey, the politically moderate governor of New York, who had run a strong campaign against FDR in 1944. Truman surprised everyone. He launched a strenuous cross-country speaking tour and hammered away at Republicans for opposing progressive legislation. By combining these issues with attacks on the Soviet menace abroad, Truman began to salvage his troubled campaign. At his rallies, enthusiastic listeners shouted, "Give him hell, Harry." Truman won and received 49.6% of the vote to Dewey's 45.1%. Map 25.4. This remarkable election foreshadowed coming political turmoil. Truman occupied the center of FDR's sprawling New Deal coalition. On his left were progressive civil rights advocates and anti-Cold War peace activists. Were progressives, civil rights advocates, and anti-Cold War peace activists. On his right were segregationist Southerners who opposed civil rights and were allied with Republicans on many economic and foreign policy issues. In 1948, Truman performed a delicate balancing act, largely retaining the support of Jewish and Catholic voters in the big cities, black voters in the North, and organized labor voters across the country. But Thurman's strong showing he carried 4 states in the Deep South, demonstrated the fragile nature of the Democratic coalition, and prefigured the revolt of the party's southern wing in the 1960s. As he tried to manage contending forces in his own party, Truman faced mounting pressures from Republicans to denounce radicals at home and to take a tough stand against the Soviet Union. The Fair Deal. Despite having to perform a balancing act, Truman and progressive Democrats forged ahead. In 1949, reaching ambitiously to extend the New Deal, Truman proposed the Fair Deal: national health insurance, aid to education, a housing program, expansion of Social Security, a higher minimum wage, and a new agricultural program. In its attention to civil rights, the Fair Deal also reflected the growing role of African Americans in the Democratic Party. Congress, however, remained a huge stumbling block, and the Fair Deal fared poorly. The same conservative coalition that had blocked Roosevelt's initiatives in his second term continued the fight against Truman's Cold War pressure, shaped political arguments about domestic social programs, while the nation's growing paranoia over internal subversion weakened support for bold extensions of the welfare state. Truman's proposals for national health insurance, for instance, was a popular idea with strong backing from organized labor, but it was denounced as socialized medicine by the American Medical Association and the insurance industry. In the end, the Fair Deal's only significant breakthrough, other than improvements to the minimum wage and Social Security, was the National Housing Act of 1949, which authorized the construction of 810,000 low-income units. The Red Scare, the hunt for communists. Cold War liberalism was premised on the grave domestic threat posed, many believed, by communists and communist sympathizers. Was there any significant Soviet penetration of the American government? Records opened after the 1991 disintegration of the Soviet Union indicate that there was, although it was largely confined to the 1930s. Among American suppliers of information to Moscow were FDR's Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Harry Dexter, White, FDR's administrative aide, Laughlin Curry, a strategically placed mid-level group in the State Department, and several hundred more, some identified only by code name, working in a range of government departments and agencies. How are we to explain this? Many of these enlistees in the Soviet cause had been bright young New Dealers in the mid-1930s when the Soviet-backed Popular Front suggested that the lines separating liberalism, progressivism, and communism were permeable. Chapter 24. At the same time, the United States was not at war and never expected to be. And when war did come, the Soviet Union was an American ally. For critics of the informants, however, there remained the time between the Nazi-Soviet pact and the German invasion of the Soviet Union, a nearly 2-year period during which cooperation with the Soviet Union could be seen in a less positive light. Moreover, passing secrets to another country, even a wartime ally, was simply indefensible to many Americans. The line between the U.S. and Soviet interests blurred for some. For others, it remained clear and definite. After World War II, however, most suppliers of information to the Soviets apparently ceased spying. For one thing, the professional apparatus of Soviet spying in the United States was dismantled or disrupted by American counterintelligence work. For another, most of the well-connected amateur spies moved on to other careers. Historians have thus developed a healthy skepticism that there was much Soviet espionage in the United States after 1947, but this was not how many Americans saw it at the time. Legitimate suspicions and real fears among what political opportunism combined to fuel the National Red Scare, which was longer and more far-reaching than the one that followed World War II. Loyalty Security Program. To insulate his administration against charges of communist infiltration, Truman issued Executive Order 9835 on March 21st, 1947, which created the Loyalty Security Program. The order permitted officials to investigate any employee of the federal government, some 2.5 million people, for subversive activities. Representing a profound centralization of power, the order sent shockwaves through every federal agency. Truman intended the order to apply principally to actions designed to harm the United States, sabotage, treason, etc., but it was broad enough to allow anyone to be accused of subversion for the slightest reason, for marching in a communist-led demonstration in the 1930s, for instance, or signing a petition calling for public housing. Along with suspected political subversives, more than 1,000 gay men and lesbians were dismissed from federal employment in the 1950s, victims of an obsessive search for anyone deemed unfit for government work. Following Truman's lead, many state and local governments, universities, political organizations, churches, and businesses undertook their own anti-subversion campaigns, which often included loyalty oaths. In the labor movement, charges of communist domination led to the expulsion of a number of unions by the Congress of Industrialized Organizations, CIO, 1949. Civil rights organizations such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, and the National Urban League, also expelled communists and fellow travelers or communist sympathizers. Thus, the Red Scare spread from the federal government to the farthest reaches of American organizational, economic, and cultural life. Reading suggestion, Rich Collection, Cold War Media, Red Scared, Commie Menace, Propaganda, Popular Culture, 2000, edited by Stephen Heller, Mitchell Larson. Teaching tip for a brief analysis of Truman's loyalty program and its unintended consequences. See the Linus Pauling and the International Peace Movement website, OSU Library, blah, 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 Presidency Project. Okay, so there's that. HUAC. The Truman administration had legitimized the vague and malleable concept of disloyalty. Others proved willing to stretch the concept even further, beginning with the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, which Congressman Martin Dies of Texas and other conservatives had launched in 1938. After the war, HUAC... After the war, HUAC helped spark the Red Scare by holding widely publicized hearings in 1947 on alleged communist infiltration in the movie industry. A group of writers and directors, dubbed the Hollywood 10, went to jail for contempt of Congress after they refused to testify about their past associations. Hundreds of other actors, directors, and writers whose names have been mentioned in HUAC investigation were unable to get work, victims of an unacknowledged but very real blacklist honored by industry executives. Other HUAC investigations had greater legitimacy. One that intensified the anti-communist crusade in 1948 involved Alger Hiss, a former New Dealer and State Department official who had accompanied Franklin Roosevelt to Yalta. A former communist, Whittaker Chambers, claimed that Hiss was a member of a secret communist cell operating in the government and had passed him classified documents in the 1930s. Hiss denied the allegations, but California Republican Congressman Richard Nixon doggedly pursued the case against him. In the early 1950s, Hiss was found guilty not of spying, but of lying to Congress about his communist affiliations and was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. Many Americans doubted at the time that Hiss was a spy, but the Viona transcripts in the 1990s corroborated a great deal of Chambers's testimony, and though no definitive proof has emerged, many historians now recognize the strong circumstantial evidence against Hiss. McCarthyism. The meteoric career of Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin marked first the apex and then the finale of the Red Scare. In February of 1950, McCarthy delivered a bombshell during his speech in Wheeling, West Virginia. I have here in my hand a list of 205, a list of names that were made known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party, and who nevertheless are still working and shaping policy in the State Department. McCarthy later reduced his numbers, gave different figures in different speeches, and never released any names or proof. But he had gained the attention he sought. American Voices, page 822. For the next 4 years, from the position as chair of the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, McCarthy waged a virulent smear campaign. Critics who disagreed with him exposed themselves to charges of being soft on communism. Truman called McCarthy's charges slander, lies, and character assassination, but could do nothing to curb him. Republicans, for their part, refrained from publicly challenging their most outspoken senator, and, on the whole, were content to reap the political benefits. McCarthy's charges almost always targeted Democrats. Despite McCarthy's failure to identify a single communist in government, several national developments gave his charges credibility with the public. The dramatic 1951 espionage trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg followed around the world, fueled McCarthy's allegations. Convicted of passing atomic secrets to the Soviet Union, the Rosenbergs were executed in 1953. As in the Hiss case, documents released decades later provided some evidence of Julius Rosenberg's guilt, though not Ethel's. Their execution nevertheless remains controversial, in part because some felt that anti-Semitism played a role in their sentencing. As also fueling McCarthy's charges were a series of trials of American communists between 1949 and 1955 for violation of the 1940 Smith Act, which prohibited Americans from advocating the violent overthrow of the government. Though civil libertarians and 2 Supreme Court justices vigorously objected, dozens of Communist Party members were convicted. McCarthy was not involved in either the Rosenberg trial or the Smith Act convictions, but these sensational events gave his wild charges some credence. In early 1954, McCarthy overreached by launching an investigation into subversive activities in the U.S. Army, when lengthy hearings, the first of their kind, broadcast on the new medium of television, brought McCarthy's tactics into the nation's living rooms. Support for him plummeted. In December of 1954, the Senate voted 67-22 to censure McCarthy for unbecoming conduct. He died from alcohol-related illness 3 years later at the age of 48. His name forever attached to the period of political repression of which he was only the most flagrant manifestation. Politics of Cold War liberalism. The politics of Cold War liberalism. As Election Day 1952 approached, the nation was embroiled in the tense Cold War with the Soviet Union and fighting a hot war in Korea. Though Americans gave the Republicans victory, radical change was not in the offing. The new president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, set the tone for what his supporters called modern republicanism and updated GOP approach that aimed at moderating, not dismantling, the New Deal state. Eisenhower and his supporters were more successors of FDR than of Herbert Hoover. Foreign policy revealed a similar continuity. Like their predecessors, Republicans saw the world in Cold War polarities. Republicans rallied around Eisenhower, the popular former commander of Allied forces in Europe, but divisions in the party persisted. More conservative party activists preferred Robert A. Taft of Ohio, the Republican leader in the Senate, who was a vehement opponent of the New Deal. A close friend of business, he particularly detested labor unions. Though an ardent anti-communist, the isolationist-minded Taft criticized Truman's aggressive containment policy and opposed U.S. participation in NATO. Taft ran for president 3 times, and though he was never the Republican nominee, he won the loyalty of conservative Americans who saw the welfare state as a waste of international affairs and a dangerous foreign entanglements. In contrast, moderate Republicans looked to Eisenhower and even to more liberal-minded leaders like Nelson Rockefeller, who supported international initiatives such as the Marshall Plan and NATO, and were willing to tolerate labor unions and the welfare state. Eisenhower was a man without a political past. Believing that democracy required the military to stand aside, he had never voted. Rockefeller, the scion of one of the richest families in America, was a Cold War internationalist. He served in a variety of capacities under Eisenhower, including as an advisor on foreign affairs. Having made his political name, Rockefeller was elected the governor of New York in 1959 and became the de facto leader of the liberal wing of the Republican Party. For 8 years between 1952 and 1960, Eisenhower steered a precarious course from the middle of the party with conservative Taft Republicans on one side and liberal Rockefeller Republicans on the other. His popularity temporarily kept the two sides at bay, though more ardent conservatives considered him a closet New Dealer. Ike, as he was widely known, proved willing to work with the mostly Democratic-controlled Congresses of those years. Eisenhower signed bills increasing federal outlays for veterans' benefits, housing, highway construction, Chapter 26, and Social Security, and he increased the minimum wage from 75 cents an hour to $1 an hour. Like Truman, Eisenhower accepted some government responsibility for the economic security of individuals, part of a broad consensus in American politics in these years. Teaching tip: the AP framework requires students to recognize how the aims and goals of the Cold War shifted between direct military involvement and periods of peaceful coexistence. America under Eisenhower. The global power realities that had called forth containment guided Eisenhower's foreign policy. New developments, however, altered the tone of the Cold War. Stalin's death in March of 1953 precipitated an intra-party struggle in the Soviet Union that lasted until 1956, when Nikita Khrushchev emerged as Stalin's successor. Khrushchev soon startled communists around the world by denouncing Stalin and detailing his crimes and blunders. He also surprised many Americans by calling for peaceful coexistence with the West and by dealing more flexibly with dissent in the communist world. But the new Soviet leader had his limits, and when the Hungarians rose up in 1956 to demand independence from Moscow, Khrushchev crushed the incipient revolution. With no end to the Cold War in sight, Eisenhower focused on limiting the cost of containment. The president hoped to economize by relying on the nuclear arsenal and de-emphasizing expensive conventional forces. Under this new look defense policy, the Eisenhower administration stepped up production of the hydrogen bomb and developed long-range bombing capabilities. So the Soviets, however, matched the United States weapon for weapon. By 1958, both nations had intercontinental ballistic missiles. When an American nuclear submarine launched an atomic-tipped Polaris missile in 1960, the Soviet engineers raced to produce an equivalent weapon. This arms race was another critical feature of the Cold War. American officials believed the best deterrent to Soviet aggression was the threat of an all-out nuclear response by the United States, which was dubbed massive retaliation by Secretary of State Dulles. Dulles. Massive retaliation, Dulles. Massive retaliation, Dulles. Massive retaliation, Dulles. 1960. Although confident in the international arena, Eisenhower started out as a novice in domestic affairs, doing his best to set a less confrontational tone. After the rancorous Truman years, he was reluctant to speak out against Joe McCarthy, and he was not a leader on civil rights. Democrats, meanwhile, maintained a strong presence in Congress, but proved weak in presidential elections in the 1950s. In the two presidential contests of the decade, 1952 and 1956, Eisenhower defeated the admired but politically ineffectual liberal Adlai Stevenson. In the 1952 election, Stevenson was hampered by the unpopularity of the Truman administration, the deadlocked Korean War, and a series of scandals that Republicans had dubbed the mess in Washington, combined to give the war hero general an easy victory. In 1956, Ike won an even more impressive victory over Stevenson, an eloquent and sophisticated spokesman for liberalism, but no match for Eisenhower's popularity with the public. During Eisenhower's presidency, new political forces on both the right and the left had begun to stir, but they had not yet fully transformed the party system itself, particularly at the national level. Democrats and Republicans seemed in broad agreement about the realities of the Cold War and the demands of the modern industrial economy and welfare state. Indeed, respected commentators in the 1950s declared the end of ideology and wondered if the grand political clashes that had racked the 1930s were gone forever. Below the apparent calm of national party politics, however, lay profound differences among Americans over the direction of the nation. Those differences were most pronounced regarding the civil rights of African Americans, but a host of other issues had begun to emerge as controversial subjects that would soon starkly divide the country in the 1960s, bring an end to the brief and fragile Cold War consensus. Containment in the post-colonial world. Containment in the post-colonial world. As the Cold War took shape, the world scene was changing at a furious pace. New nations were emerging across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, created in the wake of powerful anti-colonial movements whose origins dated to before World War II. Between 1947 and 1962, the British, French, Dutch, and Belgian empires all but disintegrated in the momentous collapse of European global reach. FDR had favored the idea of national self-determination, often to the fury of his British and French allies. He expected emerging democracies to be new partners in an American-led free market world system, but colonial revolts produced many independent or socialist-minded regimes in the so-called Third World as well. Third World was a term that came into usage after World War II to describe the developing or ex-colonial nations in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East that were not aligned with the Western capitalist countries led by the United States or the socialist states of Eastern Europe led by the Soviet Union. The Truman and Eisenhower administrations often treated the Third World countries as pawns of the Soviet Union to be opposed at all costs. The Cold War and colonial independence. Insisting that all nations had to choose sides, the United States drew as many countries as possible into the collective security agreements with the NATO alliance in Europe as a model. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles orchestrated the creation of the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, SEATO, which in 1954 linked the United States and its major European allies with Australia, New Zealand, Pakistan, the Philippines, and Thailand. An extensive system of defense alliances, everything that tied the United States to more than 40 other countries. The United States also sponsored a strategically valuable defensive alliance between Iraq and Iran on the southern flank of the United States. Despite American rhetoric, the United States was often concerned less about democracy than about stability. The Truman and Eisenhower administrations tended to support government no matter how repressive that were overtly anti-communist. Some of America's staunchest allies, the Philippines, South Korea, Iran, Cuba, South Vietnam, and Nicaragua, were governed by dictatorships or right-wing regimes that lacked broad-based support. Moreover, Eisenhower's Secretary of State Dulles often resorted to covert operations against governments that, in his opinion, were too closely aligned with the Soviets. For these covert tasks, Dulles used the newly created 1947 Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, run by his brother, Allen Dulles. When Iran's democratically elected nationalist premier, Mohandas Mossadegh, seized British oil properties in 1953, CIA agents helped depose him and installed the young Mohammad Reza Pahlavi as Shah of Iran. Iranian resentment of the coup, followed by 25 years of U.S. support for the Shah, eventually led to the 1979 Iranian Revolution, Chapter 30. In 1954, the CIA also engineered a coup in Guatemala against the democratically elected president Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, who had seized land owned by the American-owned United Fruit Company. Arbenz offered to pay United Fruit the declared value of land, but the company rejected the offer and turned to the U.S. government. Eisenhower specifically approved those CIA efforts that expanded the agency's mandate from gathering intelligence to intervening in the affairs of sovereign states. Vietnam. But when covert operations and coups failed or proved impractical, the American approach to emerging nations could entangle the United States in deeper, more intractable conflicts. One example was already unfolding on a distant stage, in a small country unknown to most Americans, Vietnam. In August of 1945, at the close of World War II, the Japanese occupiers of Vietnam surrendered to China in the north and Britain in the south. The Viet Minh, the nationalist movement that had led the resistance against the Japanese and the French prior to 1940, seized control in the north, but their leader, Ho Chi Minh, was a communist, and this single fact outweighed American and British commitment to self-determination. When France moved to restore its control over the country, the United States and Britain sided with their European ally. President Truman rejected Ho's plea to support the Vietnamese struggle for nationhood, and France rejected Ho's offer of a negotiated independence. Shortly after France returned in late 1946, the Viet Minh resumed their war of national liberation. Eisenhower picked up where Truman left off. If the French failed, Eisenhower argued, all non-communist governments in the region would fall like dominoes. This so-called domino theory, which represented an American extension of the containment doctrine, guided U.S. policy in Southeast Asia for the next 20 years. The United States eventually provided most of the financing for the French war, but money was not enough to defeat the determined Viet Minh, who were fighting for liberation of their country. After a 56-day siege in early 1954, the French were defeated at a huge fortress at Dien Bien Phu. The result was the 1954 Geneva Accords, which partitioned Vietnam temporarily at the 17th parallel and called for elections within the 2 years to unify the strife-torn nation. The United States rejected these Geneva Accords and set about undermining them. With the help of the CIA, a pro-American government took power in South Vietnam in June of 1954. Ngo Dinh Diem, an an anti-communist Catholic who had been residing in the United States, returned to Vietnam as premier. The next year, Alright, going back to Eisenhower. Eisenhower picked up where Truman left off. If the French failed, Eisenhower argued, all the non-communist governments in the region would fall like dominoes. This so-called domino theory, which represented an extension of the containment doctrine, guided U.S. policy in Southeast Asia for the next 20 years. The United States eventually provided most of the financing for the French War, but money was not enough to defeat the determined Viet Minh who were fighting for the liberation of their country. After a 56-day siege in early 1954, the French were defeated at the huge fortress of Dien Bien Phu. The result was the 1954 Geneva Accords, which partitioned Vietnam temporarily at the 17th parallel and called for elections within 2 years to unify the strife-torn nation. The United States rejected the Geneva Accords and set about undermining them. With the help of the CIA, a pro-American government took power in South Vietnam in June of 1954. Diem, an anti-communist Catholic who had been residing in the United States, returned to Vietnam as premier. The next year, in a rigged election, Diem became president of an independent South Vietnam. Facing certain defeat by the popular Ho Chi Minh, Diem called off the scheduled reunification elections. As the last French soldiers left in March of 1956, the Eisenhower administration propped up Diem with an average of $200 million a year in aid and a contingent of 675 American military advisors. This support was just the beginning. The Middle East. If Vietnam was still of minor concern, the same could not be said of the Middle East, an area rich in oil and political complexity. The most volatile area was Palestine, populated by Arabs, but also historically the ancient land of Israel, and coveted by the Zionist movement as a Jewish national homeland. After World War II, many survivors of the Nazi extermination camps resettled in Palestine, which was still controlled by Britain under a World War I mandate. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly voted to partition Palestine between Jewish and Arab sectors. When the British mandate ended in 1948, Zionist leaders proclaimed the State of Israel. A coalition of Arab nations known as the Arab League invaded, but Israel survived. Many Palestinians fled or were driven from their homes during the fighting. The Arab defeat left these people permanently stranded in refugee camps. President Truman recognized the new state immediately, which won him crucial support from Jewish voters in the 1948 election, but alienated the Arab world. Southeast of Palestine, Egypt began to assert its presence in the region. Having gained independence from Britain several decades earlier, Egypt remained a monarchy until 1952 when Gamal Abdel Nasser led a military coup that established a constitutional republic. Caught between the Soviet Union and the United States, Nasser sought an independent route, a pan-Arab socialism designed to end the Middle East's colonial relationship with the West. When negotiations with the United States over Nasser's plan to build a massive hydroelectric dam on the Nile broke down in 1956, he nationalized the Suez Canal, which was the lifeline for Western Europe's oil. Britain and France, in alliance with Israel, attacked Egypt and seized the canal. Concerned that the invasion would encourage Egypt to turn to the Soviet Union for help, Eisenhower urged France and Britain to pull back. He applied additional pressure through the UN General Assembly, which called for a truce and troop withdrawal. When the Western nations backed down, however, Egypt reclaimed the Suez Canal and built the Aswan Dam on the Nile with Soviet support. Eisenhower had likely avoided a larger war, but the West lost a potential ally in Nasser. In early 1957, concerned about Soviet influence in the Middle East, the president announced the Eisenhower Doctrine, which stated that American forces would assist any nation in the region that required aid against overt armed aggression from any nation controlled by international communism. Invoking the doctrine later that year, Eisenhower helped King Hussein of Jordan put down a Nasser-backed revolt and propped up a pro-American government in Lebanon. The Eisenhower Doctrine was further evidence that the United States had extended the global reach of containment, in this instance accentuated by the strategic need to protect the West's access to steady supplies of oil. In early 1957, concerned about Soviet influence in the Middle East, the president announced the Eisenhower Doctrine, which stated that American forces would assist any nation in the region that required aid against overt armed aggression from any nation controlled by international communism. Invoking the doctrine later that year, Eisenhower helped King Hussein of Jordan put down a Nasser-backed revolt and propped up a pro-American government in Lebanon. The Eisenhower Doctrine was further evidence that the United States had extended the global reach of containment, in this instance accentuated by the strategic need to protect the West's access to steady supplies of oil. John F. Kennedy and the Cold War. John F. Kennedy and the Cold War. Charisma, style, and personality. These more than platforms and issues defined a new brand of politics in the early 1960s. This was John F. Kennedy's natural environment. Kennedy, a Harvard alumnus, World War II hero, and senator from Massachusetts, had inherited his love of politics from his grandfather, colorful and often ruthless Irish Catholic politicians in Boston. Ambitious and deeply aware of style, the 43-year-old Kennedy made use of his many advantages to become a novelist. Norman Mailer put it, "Our leading man. His one disadvantage, that he was Catholic in a country that had never elected a Catholic president, he masterfully neutralized, and thanks to both media advisors and his youthful attractiveness, Kennedy projected a superb television image." At heart, however, Kennedy was a cold warrior who had come of age in the shadow of Munich, Yalta, and McCarthyism. He projected an air of idealism. But his years in the Senate, 1953 to 1960, had proved him to be a conventional Cold War politician. Once elected president, Kennedy would shape the nation's foreign policy by drawing both on his ingenuity and on old-style Cold War power politics. The election of 1960 and the new frontier. Kennedy's Republican opponent in the 1960 presidential election. Kennedy's Republican opponent in the 1960 presidential election, Eisenhower's Vice President Richard Nixon, was a seasoned politician and a Cold Warrior himself. The great innovation of the 1960 campaign was a series of 4 nationally televised debates. Nixon, less photogenic than Kennedy, looked sallow and unshaven during the intense studio lights. Voters who heard the first debate on the radio concluded that Nixon had won, but those who viewed it on television favored Kennedy. Despite the edge Kennedy enjoyed in the debates, he won only the narrowest of electoral victories, receiving 49.7% of the popular vote to Nixon's 49.5%. Kennedy attracted Catholics, African Americans, and the labor vote. His vice presidential running mate, Texas Senator Lyndon Baines Johnson, helped bring in Southern Democrats. Yet only 120,000 votes separated the two candidates, and a shift of a few thousand votes in key states would have reversed the outcome. Kennedy brought to Washington a cadre of young, ambitious newcomers, including Robert McNamara, a renowned systems analyst and former head of Ford Motor Company, as Secretary of Defense. A host of trusted advisors and academics flocked to Washington to join the new frontier. Kennedy's term for the challenges the country faced. Included on the team as Attorney General was Kennedy's younger brother, Robert, who had made a name as a young hard-hitting investigator of organized crime. Relying on an old American trope, Kennedy's New Frontier suggested masculine toughness and adventurism and encouraged Americans to again think of themselves as exploring uncharted terrain. That terrain proved treacherous, however, as the new administration immediately faced a crisis. Crisis in Cuba and Berlin. In January of 1961, the Soviet Union announced that it intended to support wars of national liberation wherever in the world they occurred. Kennedy took Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev's words as a challenge, especially as they applied to Cuba, where in 1959 Fidel Castro had overthrown the right-wing dictator Fulgencio Batista and declared a revolution. Determined to keep Cuba out of the Soviet orbit, Kennedy followed through on the Eisenhower administration plans to dispatch Cuban exiles to foment an anti-Castro uprising. The invaders, trained by the Central Intelligence Agency, were ill-prepared for their task. On landing at Cuba's Bay of Pigs on April 17, 1961, the force of 1,400 was crushed by Castro's troops. Kennedy prudently rejected CIA pleas for a U.S. airstrike. Accepting defeat, Kennedy went before the American people and took full responsibility for the fiasco, map 25.6. Already strained by the Bay of Pigs incident, U.S.-Soviet relations deteriorated further in June of 1961 when Khrushchev stopped movement between the communist-controlled East Berlin and the city's western sector. Kennedy responded by dispatching 40,000 more troops to Europe in mid-August to stop the exodus of East Germans. The communist regime began constructing the Berlin Wall, policed by border guards under shoot-to-kill orders. Under the 12-foot-high concrete barrier, until the 12-foot-high concrete barrier came down in 1989, it served as the supreme symbol of the Cold War. A perilous Cold War confrontation came next, in October of 1962. In a somber televised address on October 22nd, Kennedy revealed that U.S. reconnaissance planes had spotted Soviet-built bases for intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Cuba. Some of those weapons had already been installed, and more were on the way. Kennedy announced that the United States would impose a quarantine on all offensive military equipment on its way to Cuba. As the world held its breath, waiting to see if the conflict would escalate into war, on October 25th, ships carrying Soviet missiles turned back. After a week of tense negotiations, both sides made concessions. Kennedy pledged to not invade Cuba, and Khrushchev promised to dismantle the missile bases. Kennedy also secretly ordered U.S. missiles to be removed from Turkey at Khrushchev's insistence. The risk of nuclear war, greater during the Cuban Missile Crisis than at any other time in the Cold War, prompted a slight thaw in U.S.-Soviet relations. As National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy put it, both sides were chastened by having come so close to the edge. Kennedy and the New World. Kennedy also launched a series of bold non-military initiatives. One was the Peace Corps, which embodied a call to public service put forth in his inaugural address. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Thousands of men and women agreed to devote 2 or more years as volunteers for projects such as teaching English to Filipino school children or helping African villagers obtain clean water. Exhibiting the idealism of the early 1960s, the Peace Corps was also a low-cost Cold War weapon intended to show the developing world that there was an alternative to communism. Kennedy championed space exploration as well. In a 1962 speech, he proposed that the nation commit itself to landing a man on the moon within the decade. The Soviets had already beaten the United States into space with the 1957 Sputnik satellite and a 1961 flight of cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin. Capitalizing on America's fascination with space, Kennedy persuaded Congress to increase funding for the government's space agency, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, enabling the United States to pull ahead of the Soviet Union. Kennedy's ambition was realized when U.S. astronauts arrived on the moon in 1969. Making a commitment in Vietnam. Despite slight improvements, U.S.-Soviet relations stayed tense and containment remained the cornerstone of U.S. policy. When Kennedy became president, he inherited the Eisenhower commitment in Vietnam. Kennedy saw Vietnam in Cold War terms, but rather than practicing brinkmanship, threatening nuclear war to stop communism, Kennedy sought what at the time seemed a more intelligent and realistic approach. In 1961, he increased military aid to the South Vietnamese and expanded the role of the U.S. Special Forces, Green Berets, who would train the South Vietnamese Army in unconventional small group warfare tactics. South Vietnam's corrupt and repressive Diem regime, propped up by Eisenhower since 1954, was losing ground in spite of American aid. By 1961, Diem's opponents, with backing from North Vietnam, had formed a revolutionary movement known as the National Liberation Front, NLF. NLF guerrilla forces, the Viet Cong, found allies among peasants alienated by Diem's strategic hamlet program, which had uprooted entire villages and moved villagers into barbed wire compounds. Furthermore, Buddhists charged Diem, a Catholic, with religious persecution. Starting in May of 1963, militant Buddhists staged dramatic demonstrations, including self-immolations recorded by reporters, covering the activities of 16,000 U.S. military personnel then in Vietnam. The self-immolations shown on television to an uneasy global audience powerfully illustrated the dilemmas of American policy in Vietnam. To ensure a stable Southern government and prevent victory for Ho Chi Minh and the North, the United States had to support Diem's authoritarian regime, but the regime's political repression of opponents made Diem more unpopular. He was assassinated on November 3, 1963. Whether one supported U.S. involvement in Vietnam or not, the elemental paradox remained unchanged in its efforts to win. The United States brought defeat ever closer. Summary: the Cold War began as a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union over Eastern Europe and the fate of post-World War II Germany. Early in the conflict, the United States adopted a strategy of containment which quickly expanded to Asia after China became a communist state under Mao Zedong. The first effect of that expansion was the Korean War, after which, under Dwight D. Eisenhower, containment of communism became America's guiding principle across the developing world, often called the Third World. Cold War tensions relaxed in the late 1950s, but erupted again under John F. Kennedy with the Cuban Missile Crisis, the building of the Berlin Wall, and major increases in American military assistance to South Vietnam. Cold War imperatives between 1945 and the early 1960s meant a major military buildup, a massive nuclear arms race, and unprecedented entanglements across the globe. On the domestic front, Harry S. Truman started out with high hopes for an expanded New Deal, only to be confounded by resistance from Congress and the competing demands of the Cold War. The greatest Cold War-inspired development was a climate of fear over internal subversion by communists that gave rise to McCarthyism. Truman's successor, Eisenhower, brought the Republicans back into power. Although personally conservative, Eisenhower actually proved a New Dealer in disguise. When Eisenhower left office and Kennedy became president, it seemed that a liberal consensus prevailed, with old-fashioned laissez-faire conservatism mostly marginalized in American political life.